A warm welcome to all of you and my sincere thanks for participating in today's event on the increasing imperative for resilient food systems in times of crisis. What can donors do? I'm Konrad Rhein, co-chair of the Global Donor Platform for Rural Development and policy officer at the European Commission. Many of you have been following the platform's work on the food systems agenda. Let me recall some of our flagship products from 2021, such as our donor declaration on intent on food systems transformation and the stock-taking report on donor contributions to food systems, both that were launched in September last year. During today's session, we are pleased to present the culmination of 2 years of work in the food systems agenda by the Donor Platform. A white paper on food systems transformation, our newly released flagship publication titled Transforming Food Systems, Directions for Enhancing the Catalytic Role of Donors. This paper offers donors a menu of options to transform our food systems, making them more resilient and sustainable. As global donors have a critical leveraging role in catalyzing food systems change, the white paper provides 7 key actions for donors to focus their attention and efforts. We have been in a state of emergency for the past 2 years. Supply chain disruptions from the pandemic and reduced yields from droughts and other extreme climate events have demonstrated the fragility and vulnerability of our food systems. But as recovery from COVID-19 impacts began, a new food crisis emerged with increasingly high costs across the globe. Food prices reached the highest ever recorded in February of this year. Of course, this issue has now been compounded with the war in Ukraine. Ukraine and Russia are both major producers and exporters of staple crops, and further in the global fertilizer market. Therefore, the war will have consequences as crop planting, harvesting, processing, and finally exports are severely disrupted. The impacts of the conflict will be felt mostly by those who are already most vulnerable and food insecure. Extensive amounts of wheat from Russia and Ukraine are exported across the African continent. The two countries together are responsible for wheat imports ranging from 33% in Eritrea to 60% in DRC, over 80% in Egypt, and an incredible 99% in Somalia. Yemen, a country where 2/3 of the population is already food insecure, imports 42% of their cereals from Russia and Ukraine. Just imagine the impacts of this food crisis on the world's most vulnerable populations. Of course, emergency measures are necessary to combat the potentially disastrous hunger and food insecurity stemming from the disrupted food production and skyrocketing food prices. But this crisis highlights the absolute necessity of long-term resilience in our food systems in order to combat and avoid such issues in the future. While global donors may not have the power to stop this war today, focusing our efforts on catalyzing change for resilient food systems will help counteract its effects far into the future. Today's session is to discuss this point exactly. How can deliberations from the Food Systems Summit contribute to development thinking now, when food prices are soaring and agricultural value chains are increasingly disrupted? And how can donor assistance, cooperation, and coordination improve resilience in agriculture, rural development, and food systems? With this, I'm pleased to pass the floor to Henry Wang-Zhu, our moderator for today's session. Henry is an international broadcaster and media consultant. He has worked as broadcaster for BBC News, Sky News, MSNBC, TRT World, and others. He has also moderated several conferences and events at the United Nations, African Union, Global Fund, and others. Again, thank you all for your attendance, and over to you, Henry.
Konrad, thank you very much indeed. That was a brilliant start. A very alarming picture that you painted, but it's a real one. We cannot varnish this in any way. So think about what Konrad told us. There's going to be a necessary emergency response, but the current crisis highlights the long-term problems we have with planning. So what can donors do? So let's move to the next phase then of today's session. And to set the seed in more detail, we're delighted to have Professor Jennifer Clapp. Now, Professor Clapp, who's going to do our keynote, is a Canadian political economist. She's a professor and Canada Research Chair in Global Food Security and Sustainability at the University of Waterloo. She is also a member of the International Panel of Experts on Sustainable Food Systems. And once Professor Clapp has spoken, we will hear from Jim Woodhill, who will give a response and talk about the white paper that Conrad mentioned. And then we will hear from our panel. And throughout this, you will be able to respond to what you hear, to put forward questions and thoughts, which we will select, and then we'll put them to our panel in the Q&A a little bit later on. In the meantime, also look at the chat box, which is where you post your comments, and you'll also see several papers that have been mentioned, which you will be able to link, click on the links and read briefly if you want to get more information. But for now, I'm delighted to hand over to Professor Jennifer Clapp, who's going to set the scene in more detail. Professor, over to you.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Henry, and it's an honor to be here today. I will just take a moment to share my screen and just want to be sure that, let's see. Excellent. Hopefully you can all see that. And as was mentioned by Conrad at the start, this is a really really overwhelming moment for global food security because of the nature of the crisis in Ukraine, and it's overlapping with many other crises happening at this time. So as we know that the dynamics in Ukraine are quite shocking in many ways, they also have wide ramifications, including for some of the world's poorest countries. And the high-level panel of experts on food security and nutrition of the Committee on World Food Security, of which I am vice chair, has been following these developments quite closely. And in fact, we've prepared a briefing note for the Committee on World Food Security that's going to be online later today. And my comments today will be highlighting some of the insights from that paper and also my own analysis of the situation. And what is striking about the current situation is that it's not just one crisis looming on the horizon. As Conrad noted, we're in the midst of a constellation of multiple overlapping food crises. It's with the Ukraine crisis just the latest facing food systems. And the situation is so dire that the UN Secretary General has called it a constellation, a hurricane of hunger. And so what I'd like to do is talk about the multiple and overlapping crises that are occurring right now and reflect towards the end on some of the policy implications and what that means for the donor community. So the first crisis that is sparked by Russia's invasion of Ukraine is obviously the immediate humanitarian emergency facing Ukrainians right now. At least 10 million Ukrainians have fled their homes to escape violence. Over 4 million Ukrainian refugees have left the country. And the World Food Program has been attempting to provide assistance to the region, but it's been extremely difficult because of the infrastructure damage to enable them to basically deliver food. There's even some reports that the Ukrainian food system has been deliberately targeted by the Russians in an attempt to use hunger as a weapon of war. And this is a very dire situation. And it's not just the inability to feed people at the particular moment that is the crisis, but the crisis is also the farming system within Ukraine. A country facing war has extreme difficulties in maintaining normal agricultural production cycles. And this is unfolding in Ukraine, which is a major producer of wheat, of maize, and sunflower oil that are major commodities traded on the world market. And at the moment, we're seeing a major disruption to the planting season in the country, and much of the agricultural infrastructure, as I noted, has been deliberately targeted. And so it's been extremely difficult to ensure that the winter wheat that was already planted can actually be harvested in the coming months, but also there's been a delay in the planting season for maize, and that season may simply be wiped out. Many farmers, if they are able to farm, if they're not fighting, they're lacking seeds and fertilizer and fuel. It's, in short, a very dire situation. And this situation of conflict interfacing with hunger is not just happening in Ukraine. And we have to remember that there are many countries in the world that are facing conflicts and violence, and this has a major impact on food security and nutrition in those countries. As we know, there are ongoing conflicts exacerbating hunger in places such as Afghanistan, Yemen, Syria, Ethiopia, Somalia, and other countries. In fact, the latest Hunger Hotspots report, which is published jointly by the World Food Programme and the FAO, notes that 65% of people who are acutely food insecure reside in countries where conflict is the major driver of hunger. Now, the second crisis sparked by this situation is a global food crisis, which is affecting food security well beyond the borders of Ukraine. Together, as was already mentioned in the opening remarks by Conrad, Russia and Ukraine account for around 1/4 of the world's wheat exports and around 1/5 of the world's maize exports. Ukraine is also a major exporter of sunflower oil, accounting for around 60% of the global market, while Russia and Belarus are major fertilizer exporters, as well as exporters of oil and natural gas. So with ports in the region blocked due to the conflict, the countries that are reliant on Ukraine and Russia's exports must find alternate supplies. And according to the UN FAO, over 30 countries rely on imported foods from the region for over 30% of their wheat imports. And for some countries, that ratio is much higher, including Egypt, Eritrea, Somalia, and Lebanon, each of which relies on these two countries alone for well over 70% of their wheat imports. And the FAO's projections, based on the severity of the shock, which we take the severe shock scenario, which I think is what we're in now, we're 8 weeks into this crisis, they're projecting up to 13 million additional people will experience severe chronic undernourishment as a result of the crisis. Now, this situation is happening on top of what was already a dire situation. In early 2022, but even before Russia attacked Ukraine, food prices had already surpassed their peaks that were reached in previous food crisis in 2008 and again in 2011-12. The price of wheat and other grains have jumped sharply since the start of the conflict on top of what was already this difficult situation. And the latest report from the FAO's Food Price Index indicated in early April that we're at an all-time high in terms of food prices. And this level is around 34% higher than it was last year in this month. So it's a very, very difficult situation. And the price rises have been particularly dramatic. And I would argue that it's been due to a number of factors that I think are worth pointing out, because these factors are what is causing that fragility and vulnerability in the global food system that was already mentioned. So I'll just talk about 3 of these factors in particular. And the first one I want to mention is the highly concentrated nature of the global food markets that we're seeing today, especially for staple grains like wheat and maize. According to USDA data, just 8 countries account for over 90% of the world's wheat exports, and just 4 countries account for over 80% of the world's maize exports. And this is a very concentrated situation in terms of concentrated geographically, but it's also concentrated commercially, because only about 4 companies control the vast majority of that trade. So we have a very concentrated market where we have a lot of countries that are reliant on just a few. A second factor affecting the volatility in food prices right now is that a growing list of countries have announced restrictions on their exports since the conflict began. A reason countries tend to do this is they want to ensure that they have sufficient domestic food supply and they want to keep prices low. But as we learned in the last food crisis, export restrictions of this type can lead to increased volatility because it reduces the amount of food available on global markets. According to the International Food Policy Research Institute, as of last week, around 16 countries had imposed export restrictions. And that includes not just Ukraine, which we might say is understandable because of the crisis, but also Russia, Hungary, Moldova, Serbia, Indonesia, and others. According to IFPRI, around 17% of the global food trade in terms of calories is actually affected by export restrictions at this time, and that has reached the level of the last food crisis. So while there's awareness of the impact of export restrictions on food prices and availability, it's not that all countries have learned this lesson. We're actually in a very similar situation now with volatility due to this cause. And a third point I wanted to mention is the market volatility on commodity markets, commodity future markets in particular. There's been some concern voiced about the potential role of financial investors and speculators on these markets that can be leading to more volatility on these markets than would be the case otherwise. In other words, when there are restricted supplies and concentrated markets, it's more possible for speculators to try to profit off of hunger by buying into the futures market, which can push the prices up higher. So all of these factors are affecting the extent of the food price increases as a result of this particular shock. Now, we all know that it's the low-income food import-dependent countries that are most affected in this situation right now. And this is important to focus on these countries, the countries in particular that depend on food imports, where we see the poorest parts of society in those countries are typically spending over 60% of their income on food. So when there are increases in world food prices, even if a small amount, it has a huge impact on people's ability to access food and to access healthy and nutritious food. Now, some have argued that the higher prices will simply lead to a supply response from farmers around the world as they have incentive now to produce more food because they will get higher prices for it. But we have to remember this is a very unique and challenging situation where we have the prices of fertilizer and other inputs also skyrocketing. And so this makes it very difficult for farmers to actually respond by increasing production because they can't access the inputs. But also we have to be aware that simply putting more land under cultivation to spur a supply response can also have environmentally damaging consequences, especially if it's bringing marginal and sensitive lands into production. So it's a very, it's a dire situation, but it's also a very complicated one, and we have to keep that in mind. Now, the third crisis that we can talk about here that is in the background because is the COVID-19 hunger pandemic. This has not gone away. We know that although the restrictions are lifting in many places, that the virus has not disappeared. And we know that during the first year of the pandemic, an additional 161 million people experienced chronic undernourishment as a result of the crisis, because there were restrictions on people's movement, but there was also a massive decline in economic growth. People lost their employment, and also that meant that their ability to command food was severely curtailed. So it's now estimated that over 800 million people in the world are chronically undernourished. And also that 2.37 billion people, that's now 1 in 3 people, are facing food insecurity at either a moderate or severe level as a result of this crisis. This is an increase of over 200 million people from the year before. And many countries in the wake of COVID-19 have depleted their capacity for social protection spending and also face now high levels of debt because we're coming on a decade of very low interest rates where it was easy to borrow, and countries have maxed out their capacity to respond. And the crisis of COVID-19 also highlighted the precarious nature of food system livelihoods, especially small-scale food producers and food system workers, who were very much affected when the dynamics were and supply chain disruptions were rippling through food systems. And on top of the COVID crisis, we also have the broader environment and climate food systems crisis, which has been, it's in the background, but we have to not forget about it because it has important implications for how we respond to these other crises. We know that food and agriculture systems account for a large chunk of greenhouse gases, 21 to 37%, according to the IPCC. We know that the industrial food production system that dominates has been associated with biodiversity decline, water scarcity, and soil depletion. And climate change is expected to result in negative yields especially in countries in the global south. And we also know that the global industrial food production system, which dominates, has been very reliant on synthetic inputs and high energy use, which can further exacerbate the climate crisis. So it's again, a series of overlapping crises that we are experiencing at the moment. And so it's not always straightforward to say it's one food crisis. When I think about this situation, I think of it as at least 4 food crises that are overlapping with one another and feeding off of one another. And these crises show us the risks more clearly and the vulnerabilities in our food systems. They show us the risks of the excessive reliance on just a handful of major exporting countries and a handful of food trading firms. They show us the risks of depending on food imports in the world's poorest countries. They show us the risks of excessive reliance on the food system of fossil energy and artificial fertilizers. And they also illustrate the vulnerability of farmers, especially small-scale farmers and food system workers, particularly in the world's poorest countries. So in this situation, we really need to reconsider how food systems are organized. While powerful actors that dominate the current global industrial food system might claim that efficiencies associated with their model of production that's highly industrial and distant supply chains, the argument for having food systems this way is that it can result in efficiencies that make food more affordable for all. But the increasingly frequent crises we've been experiencing with this model of production has resulted in the exact opposite effect, with the poorest and most marginalized people bearing the costs at times when crises arise. So it is increasingly evident that the organization of food systems needs to be rethought. The current food systems that are operating tend to be rigid, they tend to be vulnerable, and this has sparked a lot of discussion in recent years on the need to transform our food systems. But I would argue, and this resonates with the white paper that will be presented today, that it is time to move beyond that talk and into action. So in other words, we need to get to understand that not just the why we need to transform food systems, but also the how. So this is outlined in the Global Donor Platform white paper, and it's also been the focus of the work of the high-level panel of experts on food security and nutrition, as well as the Committee on World Food Security in recent years. It's getting to the how through policy recommendations and guidance to get us there. So now I want to shift to just talk about some of the policy responses. And first, I want to talk about some of the key principles that I think are important for donors to keep in the foreground when formulating policies in response to these crises. And again, these resonate closely with the principles that are outlined in the white paper of the Global Donor Platform, as well as the HLPE and the CFS. These principles include, first of all, upholding human rights, including the right to food. This is essential to keep human rights at the center of policy responses, because the right to food is a fundamental human right, and it's important that we keep this always in view. It's also important to approach policies using a food systems lens. And here I want to stress it's important to think about not just food systems as a system, but the system of systems, where we have food systems interacting with health systems, with economic systems, with environmental systems, health systems. They're all connected. And we need to keep that in mind, that policies need to embed within this intersystems linkages. It's also important to focus on the empowerment of the most marginalized and vulnerable populations, especially by addressing structural barriers that these populations face within food systems. So the rigidities in food systems often are the result of structural barriers that prevent the most marginalized and vulnerable people from not just accessing food, but from participating fully in food systems as consumers, as well as in terms of their employment and also establishing food system governance. So it's important to break down those barriers. It's also important that we focus on the strengthening the resilience of food systems. And to do this, we need to think about enhancing sustainability, equity, and diversity. And that's across all parts of food systems, from production to distribution to diets. We need sustainability, equity, and diversity at the center. We also need to ensure transparency, accountability, and responsibility in investment in policy responses. And finally, we need coordination of policy responses at the international level. Having many different policy responses that aren't coordinated with one another is likely to lead to results that are not satisfactory, because they could be working at counter purposes. So in this sense, this gathering today to talk about these issues, it's really important to stress the significance of policy coordination. So I just kind of outlined some of the priorities at both the short term and the medium and long term. And these, I can only focus on a few because of time limitations. And these resonate with some of the policy recommendations we've made in our briefing note from the HLPE. The first, in the immediate term, it's important to increase significantly the humanitarian assistance in Ukraine, as well as in other countries experiencing conflict-driven famine. This is, as I mentioned, conflict is a leading cause of hunger in many countries, and it's important that the humanitarian agencies are able to do their work. And agencies such as the World Food Programme are chronically underfunded and need that support to reach those who are facing that emergency crisis. It's also important to provide assistance, including debt relief, to the poorest food import dependent countries to enable them to source alternate food supplies in the short term, as the supply chains from the Black Sea region have been severely disrupted, affecting countries across Africa and the Middle East in particular. It's also important to provide assistance to strengthen the enabling environments for food security and nutrition in the affected regions. And this includes providing not just food assistance, but also assistance to ensure that education and health systems, et cetera, are able to function properly, so that that provides that enabling environment for food security and nutrition. And it's not just about providing assistance, it's also that exporting countries have responsibilities in this situation as well. It's important for exporting countries to refrain from export restrictions and grain hoarding that could lead to higher food prices. And governments should also closely watch commodity markets for excessive speculation in order to ensure that there is no profiting from hunger by financial investors that could exacerbate the situation. There are also medium to long-term priorities as well. As was emphasized at the start of this session, it's essential that we have both the short-term and the longer-term transformative kinds of responses. So here, just to stress the importance of enhancing and diversifying domestic food production, especially in the world's poorest and most food import dependent countries. This kind of a measure to enhance and diversify production at the domestic level is essential to counter the problems of concentration in the global food markets and import dependence that creates vulnerability to shocks. It's also important to invest in climate resilient food production methods that provide decent livelihoods for small scale producers. And that includes those who are the most marginalized and facing structural barriers, including women, youth, Indigenous farmers. And it's also important to invest in market infrastructure to revitalize food production and trade at the local and regional levels. It's not enough just to increase domestic production. We also have to think about revitalizing and invigorating local and regional supply chains to create diversity in terms of the foods available, but also decent livelihoods for traders, food processors, and other food system workers at the local level. And it's also important to invest in more adaptive social protection systems that can ensure food production and nutrition in the face of shocks, especially for the poorest and most vulnerable people. In other words, it's not enough to try to do social protection in emergency fits and stops every time there's a crisis. We need to have adaptive social protection systems that can ramp up when shocks occur so that nobody is left behind. And finally, just a suggestion to think about the adoption of something like a United Nations Committee on World Food Security Global Food Crisis Response Framework. In other words, a framework that we can go to when crises occur to guide policy responses in the future. And this is already there's a protected crises framework that is very useful, but a global food crisis response framework might be able to provide that kind of coordination internationally that governments and donors can go to when these crises do emerge, because they are emerging more frequently, to have a set of policy guidance that is already there. So just to conclude, the wider implications of the war in Ukraine have forced us to confront the urgent need for food systems transformation. And the problems, as I've outlined, are very clear. Conflict-driven hunger is enormous right now, and it has wider consequences globally. Concentrated supply chains and dependence on them by some of the poorest countries create vulnerabilities in our food systems. There are limited budgets in the poorest countries for social protection. And the ecological consequences of the current agricultural trajectory are dire. And the food system livelihoods, especially for small-scale producers, small-scale traders, and food system workers, are very precarious. So in short, crisis as usual is no longer an option. We need to make progress in transforming food systems and take from thought to action urgently. And with that, I'll say thank you, and I look forward to the discussion.
Well, I have to say, Professor Clapp, thank you very much indeed for that presentation. If anybody, any of our 100 or so people joining us today expected a cozy chat between friends, well, I think they've been very quickly disabused of that notion. I mean, if I had a word cloud to sum up the last 25 or so minutes, dire, complicated, crisis, rigid, vulnerable. I mean, 8 countries accounting for the vast majority of wheat exports, 9 countries for the vast majority of maize export. What you're demanding, I would suggest, is nothing less than a revolution in how we organize food within country, across country, region, and around the world. How ready do you think are we, the powers that be, both national and multinational, to step up to this moment?
Well, I think that we need to be ready to step up to this moment, because the lessons have been there for us to see over and again in recent years with these multiple crises. And I do think there is a growing understanding of the need to enhance diversity within our food systems. We know that diversity is a key element of building resilience, because it creates multiple opportunities for production, for distribution, and for consumption that can pick up the slack when crises happen in different parts of food systems. So that diversity is the key, and I think that's the main message. And I do think that it's starting to sink in, but it needs to sink in a bit faster. And I think we need to put the resources towards that diversity as well.
One supplementary question before we bring in Jim Woodhill, who wrote the white paper, and our other panelists. And by the way, we have lots of people participating, listening, watching on this platform, and also on YouTube. You're most welcome. We've also had a couple of questions in already, which we'll get to later, from Lucas Kia and Tina Huivo. Please, if you have more things to say, do put them into the chat box. But just thinking about the pressures on countries at the moment and the vested interests who like the fact that they are responsible for huge amounts of food supply and they're getting very rich from it. How can one persuade those countries and those organizations that have done very well out of this restricted system that crisis as usual is no longer an option?
Thank you, Henry. It's a great question, and it's a great political economy question for sure. But as we have seen, when these crises occur frequently, it can really lead to political instability around the world. And that, I think, is really important for those who are benefiting from this concentrated system and want to keep things as they are. They need to understand that those instabilities can quickly unravel the benefits they're receiving from the system. And so building that diversity is essential. And I would say also that as an academic, I have the luxury of being able to go back and read, history and documents from, for example, the 1974 World Food Crisis World Food Conference that was responding to a similar crisis moment at that time. And the main policy recommendations coming out of that particular conference many years ago was that we need to increase food production capacity in all countries, especially those countries facing crisis. And so that principle of diversity of production was front and center at the international level at that time. And I think it's about time we come back to some of those key principles. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. So we're going back 50 years, Professor, as the French might say, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. The more things change, the more they stay the same. Well, we've got questions for you, Professor, and we'll put them to you a little bit later on. And before we move to Jim Woodhill, the author of the white paper with its 7 key recommendations, I should say we were expecting to be joined by Madame Rhoda Peace-Tumusimi, who is the former Commissioner for Rural Economy and Agriculture at the African Union Commission, but she's being awarded with a special prize today by the government of Uganda, something which we're delighted about. But as a result of that, she cannot join us. However, Madame Tumusimi did send us this message about the importance of food systems transformation and the lessons learned from the 2008 crisis. Please run VT.
Thank you very much. I'm glad that I'm attending this important session on food systems approach, which is a new concept. Colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, we can draw lessons from past experience, and we reference the 2008 food crisis in relation to country and donor actions in Africa. At that time, I see that leadership, together with the donors, underpinned effective policy actions were the 2 main aspects which mattered the most for the successes we achieved at that time. This is evidence-based. It is not hearsay. So committed leadership is needed even now. Again, food systems concept has to be fully acknowledged. It has to be owned, and it has to be appreciated at the level of heads of state, at the level of ministers, and permanent secretaries. Of course, these have to be supported by a committed technocrat. All of them must speak to the food systems approach in Africa, in their countries. Donors and partners have to increasingly own our country systems in capacity building, institutional collaboration. I see alignment to CADAP as being key and important. The partners need support the country investment plans. They have to support the biannual reviews, and they have to make them quality. Of course, the data and information is very key. Focus on incentive systems and rewards, the type of GAFS by the G8, I remember, through the World Bank at that time was key in catalyzing CADAP country investment plans. Both big and small resources matter in the case of food systems. Generally, donors are part and parcel of the solution if we have to avoid another crisis in Africa. Finally, A search for a long-lasting solution is the answer. We need sustainable food systems which stand the test of time. We can't be all the time firefighting. Countries, together with African Union and partners, should never again lose the momentum to avoid what befell the successes of 2008 food crisis response in Africa, which had already taken root. Planning in a coordinated effort with focus on short, medium, and long-term strategies will make Africa become food and nutritionally secure. Thank you very much for listening to me, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen.
Well, that was Madam Rhoda Peace Tumusimi. Congratulations again to her on her award, and a very, very blunt message there. We're not learning the lessons from the 2008 crisis. Business as usual is not an option. Well, in a moment, we're going to hear from our specially convened panelists who are drawn from IFAD and the European Commission. But to set us up for this next stage, I'm delighted to introduce Jim Woodhill, who's Director of the Agri-Food Nexus and Honorary Research Associate. And Jim is the author of today's white paper, which is the focus of our deliberations today. Welcome, Jim. Just thinking, what are the key messages of the paper, and how do they relate to the crises discussed by Professor Clapp? Jim.
Great, thanks, Henry, and good afternoon, everybody, wherever you might be in the world, whether it's good evening or good morning or good afternoon. And great pleasure that everybody managed to join us. I think what we're hearing, Henry, from both what Jennifer and Rhoda are saying is, of course, all of our future security and well-being is absolutely fundamentally linked to this massive transformation in food systems that we're all talking about that is needed. And just before I say a little bit more about that, I mean, just to clarify, I certainly had a hand in putting stuff on paper for the white paper, but it really is a very big collective effort from the platform secretariat, and it also involved a tremendous amount of consultation across all of the donor community, members of the Global Donor Platform for Rural Development, and it also drew very heavily on all of the outcomes from the United Nations Food Systems Summit. So with that said, I mean, just a few points before we get into the broader discussion. And I think the first thing that, of course, is really well highlighted by what Jennifer is saying is that we really do need very deep structural changes in how societies are functioning and how economies are functioning if we're going to shift from the sort of why of food systems transformation to the how. And I guess the point that the white paper makes is that donors can play a very critical role in supporting that transformation. But to be effective in that role, they really need to focus first on getting coordination right, in alignment, both in terms of what they're doing abroad, but also within their own countries. The second critical point is a need to really focus very seriously on these structural barriers. It's no longer about just putting band-aids on things, and we've heard the discussions about how we're coming back and revisiting problems in the past. So, you know, we really need to shift from investing in crises, I think, to investing in some of the deeper resilience that is needed to make sure we don't keep on having to revisit these crises. And in some of the background work we did, it was very clear that expenditure on tackling crises has gone up, but expenditure on tackling the underlying causes hasn't gone up over the last decade. And the final point is, and again, very much mentioned by Jennifer, the need to take a really systemic approach to work across sectors, to work across scale, to work across stakeholder groups. Now, I think the UN Food Systems Summit made a very substantial progress engaging many different stakeholders. I think the whole exercise around the dialogues, the exercises of starting to develop national transformation pathways were really important and very significant. And what the white paper tries to do is to pick up on all of that work from the summit and say, okay, how can donors really contribute into that? And Conrad at the beginning mentioned we've got 7 key areas and a whole list of different sorts of policies and actions that donors can follow through on to support follow-up to the UN Food Systems Summit. But I think broadly around this, if we're thinking about the deeper structural transformations are needed, there's basically four big transitions we really need to be thinking about. I mean, the first one obviously is about consumption. I mean, how do we really get people eating healthily and sustainably? Some of the structural changes around that have obviously got to do with cultural attitudes, education issues, how we understand these issues in society, but it also has to do with marketing and the incentives. We also need to be obviously producing food with environmental limits, and we need to make sure that those that are working in the food system are earning a decent living. And then the fourth big transition we need is this one around resilience, making sure that we have the buffers, that the system can cope with shocks, that food prices don't go through the roof when we have the current sort of situation that we're currently dealing with. So if we think about donors, I mean, donors actually make a relatively small investment into food systems at large. But I think what we explored and looked at through this white paper is that there was particular places where donors really can have a very catalytic role. One really important area is obviously around innovation, getting the science right, getting the data information systems right, getting technology being used as effectively as it can. So there's all sorts of things that can be done from global to local levels in really supporting that whole package of innovation that's needed to transform food systems. The second area is none of this is going to shift if we don't get the right sorts of alliances and partnerships at national level, at global level, at regional level, between business and the private sector, between private sector and civil society, business and government working together. And a lot of process needs to go on to get that happening. So donors can really invest in those partnerships, those relationships, those alliances that are needed to underpin the change. And thirdly, another critical area, and Jennifer has mentioned quite a number of areas, is really getting the policy shift. I mean, we really are going to need very fundamental policy shifts, particularly at national level, but supported by a more enabling environment at global and national, global and regional levels. So within all of that, trying to create more of sort of innovation sort of culture or context that could really help us to be much more explicit and have a much deeper understanding about the structural barriers, but also the enabling conditions. I mean, it's no point just talking about the negatives, all of this. We've got to look at the positive examples. We've got to look at the constructive examples. We've got to look at the fantastic stuff that many people are doing about improving value chains, the great work that many small-scale farmers are doing, the great work that many women's groups are doing, and really build on those positives to try and bring about this deeper structural change. And I think that's, again, where donors can have a really important role in sort of scaling up, supporting, bringing to the fore some of these niche innovations that hopefully can start to challenge and break down some of the existing structural barriers that we have. So I guess that's enough to just sort of kick off some of the thinking that sits in the white paper. Please go and have a look at it. There's quite a lot more there than what I can say in a few minutes, and I think we'll discuss a lot of those issues much more over the coming part of the discussion. So thank you, Henry.
Thank you very much, Jim. Before I let you go, I mean, I was scribbling furiously again, as I was with Professor Jennifer. And if I could just see a word cloud in front of me, consumption, cultural attitude, structural barriers, alliances, partnerships, investment, catalyzing things. I thought, my God, I've got so much to ask you. But I'll just boil it down to this. What are your realistic hopes for what this white paper, the product of 2 years of thinking and sweating and crafting, your realistic hopes for what it can do? Because we don't want a future Rhoda in 10 years or a future Jennifer in 50 years to say, that was the thinking back in 2022, and here we are in 2072 in the same place. What do you honestly hope and believe it can do, this white paper?
Well, I think it fits into a much bigger jigsaw of lots of change that are happening. I mean, I don't think we should underestimate the really significant thinking that the UN Food Systems Summit brought on food systems and taking more of a systems approach. I think the what we heard in talking with donors who are part of the platform is, that is starting to really shift and reshape some of the thinking. I think it is starting to get much more attention to some of these resilient sorts of issues. So it's of course not something that's going to be any magic bullet, but I think all the work that's going on, the tremendous work that's happening in the CFS that Jennifer has just been talking about, the flow on from that, I think it all adds up to giving quite some momentum. So I think what we would hope is that the white paper gives a very good basis for what donors can do in really making sure that they're taking forward the outcomes of the UN Food System Summit, really investing in the right places, and I guess getting this right balance in the sorts of things that they can invest in to drive the innovation that's going to be needed.
Jim, for the moment, thank you very much indeed. Thanks to Jim Woodhill, co-author of the report. Now let's meet our panelists. There were due to be 4, but we know already Madam Rhoda Peace Tumusimi is away getting an award from the Ugandan government. We're also hoping to be joined by Martin Bwalia, Adjunct Director, Knowledge Management and Program Evaluation at Outer NEPAD. He sadly is unable to be with us, but we are joined by Madam Satu Santala, Associate Vice President for External Relations and Governance at IFAD. Welcome to you. And Mr. Leonard Misti, Head of Unit Sustainable Agri-Food Systems and Fisheries at the Directorate General of Partnerships at the European Commission. So Satu and Leonard, thank you very much for joining us. So you heard from Professor Clapp there. She outlined the many issues we're facing, the overlapping food and global crises, the history of them, and the absolute necessity of food systems transformation. Satu, first of all to you, what is the most critical leverage point for creating more resilient food systems? And people, as you can see in the Q&A, the chat box, that is something I think they really want to know. The most critical leverage point.
Thank you, Henry. And I have to say that listening to both Professor Clapp, I hope you'll allow me to call you Jennifer from now on, sorry, I forgot your name.
Jim.
Jim, yes, I wanted to call you, yes, Jim. It's really like nothing new under the sun kind of a thing. We all sing from the same hymn sheet. We all share the same concern and the same view that really we already, this is not something that the crisis that was born a few weeks ago with the war in Ukraine. This is really a disaster that's been in the making for quite some time, and is repeating itself with increasing volume or increasing speed and increasingly threatening for those, especially in the poor countries. And you know, if you are a poor person living in a rural area, let's say in an African country, the label of the current crisis really does not matter that much. You're experiencing extreme stress year after year, and this is really where we are. And the way you described it, Jennifer, multiple and overlapping crises, that is really the reality we're seeing. And also you very well described the concentrated system and the lack of diversity in our food systems. And I can just throw in another example that's highlighted by IFAD's Rural Development Report, which, by the way, repeats a lot of the similar analysis and points. This year's report was entirely focused on food systems. So that report has, for example, the fact that 60% of our food energy intake is based on 3 crops: wheat, rice, and maize. Just another factor or another example of how concentrated our systems are. And, you know, this makes the system so vulnerable to the various crisis and has extremely massive global repercussions. So in order to get to this diversity point, what I really wanted to highlight here, as you know, to your question of what's the most critical leverage point, I would turn our gaze to or attention to smallholders, small agribusinesses and small and medium-sized enterprises, and really to empower these to produce more, to be more central in our food systems. In order for them to do so, investments are required in infrastructure, production inputs, market access. Policies need to change to be more enabling for them to participate in this sector, and to support them because they typically produce more diverse crops, and of course they're much more they're very central to the local and regional food markets that were also highlighted as critical earlier. And also, so then these producers can also play a vital role in improving nutrition through more varied diets. They're also, we can provide them with better livelihood opportunities, which again improves resilience. And also we can use strong models for environmentally sustainable production at the local level. So this is what I would like to highlight here. Let's take that kind of an approach, grow from, look at what we can do to better empower the small scale producers and the food chain that relies on these smaller players. And we all know what needs to be done. It really, we need to move to actually doing it. And for example, at IFAD, our current replenishment round, IFAD 12, really has resilience at the core. And this is very much in line with what we already are doing and are looking with our partners to scale up. And I think Rhoda Pease-Tumusimi said it really well, that we really must learn the lessons from the previous crisis and just get on with it. Thanks.
Thank you very much for the moment, Satu Santala, speaking on behalf of IFAD. Let me move to Leonard Mitzi, who's speaking on behalf of the European Commission. And it's funny just listening to what Satu said there. It reminds me of a visit I made to the Gambia some years ago. I did an interview with the former president there, who had a policy of grow what you eat and eat what you grow. That was, and he decided to unilaterally ban the importation of rice from Southeast Asia, but without having the infrastructure in place. So Yahya Jammeh's plan did not work. You have to plan for these things. So there we go. People have been thinking about this for quite some time. So same question essentially to Leonard Mitzi. What is the most critical leverage point for creating more resilient food systems? We've heard about, the smallholder farmers and infrastructure, building resilience, more varied diets. How can you build on that from what Satu has said?
So thanks a lot. Thanks, Henry. I will not repeat or summarize what other speakers said. First of all, we need to learn from the lessons learned of the 2007-2010 crisis. We know pretty well what works well. The only complexity today compared to 12, 15 years ago is that we are living in a more complex and not easily tractable situation. 2007 and 8, it was primarily an economic financial shock. Now we are in a war, compounded by stresses of a climate change nature, which is more intense to what was experienced 12, 15 years ago. And clearly compounded by two big players. I was speaking about Ukraine and Russia, of concentrated markets in terms of commodities and fertilizer use. So this is a complicated issue, which adds to what we were emerging out from the COVID crisis. And these very days, there is this big discussion in the IMF and the World Bank, because this is not only a food issue, this is a food, energy, and finance issue. So first of all, we need clearly a multilateral solution to this. Tinkering on the borders will not do the trick here. So it's easy as a donor community to give some social protection here and there and safety nets here and there. We know this will work for the short term, and that is why the European Commission unveiled a communication a few weeks ago, which will look into the short, medium to long term, similar to what Jennifer said. The only challenge is that the firepower of the donor community in 2022 is not there, because we came out from the COVID crisis, where all the ammunition was basically spent on vaccine and vaccine sharing. Now, I'm not saying that there is no money from the donor community. I'm saying that the firepower is pretty limited because it was already logged in 2021. At least this is from the European Union and the member states' point of view. So what we are trying to do, first of all, is identifying what are the lessons learned in terms of previous crises, but also what we learned from the UN Food System Summit and Nutrition for Growth. This was not 10 years ago, this was a few months ago. We should not forget that all this debate was already happening in 2021. So, and I'm following a bit the chat. Clearly, we will continue, and we have been supporting farmers' organizations. This is at the core. It has to be the most vulnerable at the center of the solution. But that requires also a change in the narrative in terms of decision making. This is not always easy, and that is why I say this is not just a magic wand of the donor community and donor coordination, which is a priority. It requires a strong buy-in, and let's focus on Africa here, but it's not only Africa. Rhoda Peace-Tumusimi, I know her since the 2007 and 8 crisis because she was AU commissioner then. It has to also that the African countries need to show leadership on CAADP. And there are still mega gaps in terms of CAADP finance, even from domestic sources. So agriculture food systems, and we're speaking about food systems, remain highly underfunded, underinvested. If one looks at the CAADP reviews, even the ones recent as 2022, shows that only a few countries, and I always mention less than 10 out of 55 countries of Africa are investing what they promised to invest in Malabo 20, 30 years ago. So that is a big issue. Now, typology of support. I saw Tina saying what type of support in terms of production inputs. Should we continue with heavily input subsidies? Subsidies which are not transformative? That is a big question. Now, some might say, yes, this is the only way forward. It's a productionist approach, high input, input subsidies, high dependence on energy. And we're saying that could be a model, but we also want to consider, and this is what the European Union is pushing, a model which is more inclusive, multi-stakeholder, and more agroecology. That might not be to the liking of many, because let's be clear as well, no one spoke about vested interests in terms of input subsidies and dependencies on input subsidies. If you want to dismantle that, you can create in the short term chaos, because you create a departure, a weaning off of input subsidies. But that could be a bit of a challenge in terms of transitioning. If you subsidize a lot input subsidies, which, to be honest, fertilizers are really scarce and really expensive. Imagine if you do a budget support which links to input subsidies. It will create a spiraling effect of costs, which might not wean off in terms of input subsidies dependency if you want to go into more climate smart agroecology approaches. So that is the second challenge, and that is what the European Union is giving signal. We will support in terms of this transitioning. Market integration. I saw a lot on market integration in Africa. If we don't settle in the context of the African continental free trade area, I just came from the European Parliament, and there was the discussion about food sovereignty or strategic autonomy, similar to what you said, Henry. Should West Africa be self-sufficient in rice? I was in Senegal, I think 12 years ago, and the aim was always to be 100% self-sufficient in rice and not to be dependent on imports. Like for those who are economists, they know the comparative and competitive costs of being self-sufficient. Ideally, one should increase self-sufficiency, but not at all costs, because the issue of trade and rebalancing trade. Now, the question is, how do you reconcile? No one mentioned rural and urban power points. Like urban consumers usually want affordable, low-cost imports. Otherwise, they usually are the hotspots, hotbeds of food rioting. Now, clearly, if you can compete on international markets on rice, so be it. But can all African countries be self-sufficient in rice, in wheat, in maize, in soya? So that is a big question also to ask the African continent. How do you specialize? How do you create regional sub-hubs? And that is also what we tried to discuss with the African Union a month ago, so that we create clusters of what we call value chains, which can really give traction from export-driven crops or commodities, cocoa, by cocoa looking into issues around deforestation-free value chains, around living incomes, around child labor. But imagine if you have to do this for 20 value chains, from palm oil to coffee to rubber. But this is the big challenge, similar to livestock, similar to agropastoralism, aquatic, blue foods. So what we are trying to do as EU is, using the UN Food System Summit pathways, identify that there is strong buy-in of governments on a transition which is more climate smart, which really goes into the direction of climate and biodiversity. 2, enhancing market integration within Africa. 3, using a humanitarian development peace lens in terms of what we want to do in countries like the DRCs, the Yemens of this world, because this is critical. We heard about the hotspots, and really putting at the core youth and gender. You can't have an inclusive process if you don't have a gender transformative approach, and you don't give a clear signal to youth that this is worth investing in. So,
and I'm going to stop you there before the police come and take you away. I can hear the siren in the background. No, there was a lot of energy there, and it was very, very focused. I like that. And you sound impatient. You sound impatient to get things done as a result of your work on the ground, which is excellent. I want to bounce back for a moment to Satu to see, because you were nodding and you looked very concentrated while Leonard was speaking. Was there anything you wanted to respond to before we go to the next round of questions?
Well, I'm agreeing with a lot that Leonard is saying, if not all of it. I think, as I said, I mean, we're all kind of thinking along the same lines, and very, I mean, excellent additional points from you, Leonard. I agree, it's not tinkering with a little solution here and there. I really like your thinking about the regional approaches. And I think, you know, we keep on going also back to the Food System Summit, and a lot of the work and the thinking and bringing together a different stakeholders that has happened, and building on that and building on that thinking. I think that's really critical. And then I really very much agree with your point on agroecology, and I saw that Tina commented on that not being a quick solution, and clearly we all know that that's not something that will resolve the immediate issues. However, while we are addressing the immediate issues, we need to think about the medium to long term and look at some of these changes that need to be taking place. We know they have to happen anyways. So I think this is important to keep in mind. Thanks.
Tremendous. Thank you very much indeed for that, Satu. And lots and lots of questions are coming through, which is excellent. Let's do a couple more follow-ups, Satu, with both you and Leonard, and then we'll bring both Jennifer and Jim in for a wider panel, and we'll take all those questions because we don't want to sideline them. People have taken their time, they're spending it with us this afternoon, and it's important to respond to what they have to say. But just looking at your role as the Associate Vice President for External Relations and Governance at IFAD, I mean, you're familiar with building partnerships, and let's think about the second and third priority areas of the white paper. They're about mobilizing responsible investment, both the private and public sector, engaging private sector actors in food systems transformation. So let's think about the focus on agribusiness in IFAD's recently released Rural Development Support report. How do you think these private sector relationships can be leveraged? Because we always go on about the private sector, they do most of the investment and the donors only do a small percentage. This is true, but these relationships have to be made to work more effectively for a greater yield. So how can these relationships be leveraged, and how can donors, including IFAD, make their support to agribusinesses effective, more effective in such times of crisis? Briefly, if you will.
Thanks, Henry. You already stole half of my speaking points, so I can.
Of course I did. Of course, because we're aligned. We're aligned.
Yeah, exactly. No, but of course it is critically important. But as you say, it doesn't happen just by us wishing that the private sector will solve it, and we've seen that it doesn't really always work to the benefit of sustainable, resilient food systems. But so again, I would mention looking at the small and medium-sized enterprises section. And involving them more deeply in food systems, in our view at IFAD, really makes local food systems more safer, cheaper, more diverse and nutritious if we do that right. And as you mentioned, our rural development report, it makes the point that access to markets is critical for success of such SMEs. And if we are to have the small scale farmers at the center of our food system transformation, as we believe we should be, if we complement that with local midstream SMEs that then link the small scale producers to markets and services, they are really critical in this space. We know that that one of the great challenges that these midstream agri-food businesses face, one of the biggest challenges is lack of capacity. So if donors can support with capacity building programs for accessing markets or finance and innovative technologies or improving yields. And then, of course, working with partners on building safe and stable business environments, especially in times of crisis, this is really very important. And to have policies in place that promote investments in SMEs, facilitate market access, trade and supply chain stability, and so on. These are really very important in these times. And as you say, of course, donors only play a limited role in terms of the finance, but oftentimes donors can provide the kind of patient risk-sharing capital that these companies need. And I think there is a lot that we can do also in terms of supporting demonstration of various business models that can then be taken to scale by private investors. But the first investments, if we can share that risk and bring that demonstration effect, that can pave the way for increased investments going forward.
Right.
Thanks.
Satu, thank you very much for that. Leonard, I have a question for you also related to the first action area of the white paper. But before I pose that question to you, was there anything in what Satu said that something that you disagreed with or you wanted to amend or respond to before I ask you a question, just to give you that chance?
Oh, I can't not agree with Satu, because we just had a major structured dialogue with IFAD 2 weeks ago where as she said, we are fully aligned. The big challenge is de-risking small ticket sizes. That is our major problem, because we have lots of nice ideas in the EU. We come up with lots of programs and initiatives. The most recent are big guarantees. But if we don't have financial institutions who de-risk on small ticket sizes, meaning sizes of less than, say, 5 million, sometimes even less than 1 million, the question is, because these need to be bankable projects, when you have a financial institution like the World Bank, IFC, or the EIB, or FMO in the Netherlands, is it easier to invest in a big solar plant, which is important, or is it more complicated to invest with a number of small farm holders who maybe have 5-6% of the value chain? If we speak about cocoa, clearly they will go to a solar farm or a big digital platform. They will not necessarily go, and that is what we need to calibrate better our instruments, especially guarantees, to the risk, more riskier investments.
But you know what, Leonard, you said that obviously they're going to go with the larger project, with the big solar plant or investment. So at what point is the decision being made, or who decides whether to go for business as usual with the big solar plant, or for the smaller, more local organization that we all say we want to support, but we consider it too much of a risk and it's not high up enough in the value chain? Who decides, and how can one change thinking at that level?
So who decides? We provide the basic instruments and the guarantees to the financial institutions. It's the financial institutions who will clearly see their portfolio and say, I want to invest there. We have a number of windows because we consider that renewable energy is part of the solution. Digital is part of the solution. Human development. So you can't say you have 100 euros and you invest 100 in food. A number of windows try to capture. Our track record, however, on food systems has been that we give a bit debate, but debate is not taken by the financial institutions. Basically, they are risk averse to go into guarantees. So blending seems to operate better, but even there, you will only see the results in maybe 5-10 years' time. You don't see a result in a year's time. So that is a bit our role as guarantors, to calibrate and maybe give more comfort to the financial institutions. However, they also need to have bankable projects. Yeah. And that is a bit the role of the farmers' organizations and the country themselves, so that they have a diverse portfolio, because we can't just go to Ghana or Senegal. It has to be a diversified portfolio, because that is how financial institutions pitch their portfolio in a diversified way.
Well, Leonard, in a way, you've sort of answered the question I was going to ask you. I was basically going to focus on the first action area of the white paper, which is, of course, strengthening coordination among donors and other actors to support national pathways for food systems transformation. You've kind of hit on the answer in amongst what you were saying there. I mean, sharpening the question, I was really going to ask you how you think such coordination can be strengthened, because there is some coordination going on, and where donors should focus their coordination efforts in food systems transformation. But you may think that you've already answered that to some degree. Do you have anything further to say?
Look, in April 20th, 2022, the best coordination today are twofold. I put it in the chat. It's G7. It's not G20, to be honest. G20 is a very complicated animal.
Yeah.
Why? Because you have a number of players there which don't want to play ball, similar to what we are discussing. And clearly, the UN Secretary General Global Crisis Response Group. We need to have a UN Secretary General steered, and the three Rome-based agency, including IFAD's president, is part of that. They unveiled their report on the 13th of April. I would want to invite everyone who is on this webinar to look into it. Maybe it's not groundbreaking yet, but we need to give the chance to the UN Secretary General to look at a systems approach from a food, energy, and finance, because this is a finance challenge as well. If we want to use special drawing rights in terms of giving the policy space, the fiscal space of countries to adjust the shocks of food price inflation, of social protection, we need to use innovative financial instruments at the highest level in terms of the fiscal space. So those are the two areas where I think coordination has to play ball. Mainly G7, where you have a very active, proactive, and very visionary German presidency, where we are working almost every week to try to find a solution, but also feeding the Secretary General of the UN with positive solutions, clearly, as long as the framework conditions are met. So everyone speaks about trade flows or export restrictions to be avoided, but we know or stock levels. Now, how are you going to unleash stock levels of, say, of a country like China and India to be sort of supporting the global public good? These are highly political decisions, which require multilateral solutions as well.
Thank you very much indeed for that, Leonard. And I must say, both you and Jennifer, Professor Clapp, have been very busy writing and typing answers to many of the questions that have come in to the Q&A, the chat. And I see that you responded to Thierry Giordano, who asked you directly how to get to a multilateral solution when the international order has never been so divided since the end of the Cold War. And that's what you said, the UN Secretary General's Global Crisis Group and the G7, the only solutions in the short term. And Thierry agrees with you, he's giving you the thumbs up, essentially. Let's bring back Professor Clapp and Dr. Woodhill, Jim Woodhill and Professor Clapp back into our discussion. First of all, before we take one or two of the questions that are coming in, any quick response, Professor Clapp, to what you've heard thus far from Satu and Leonard in their responses? Anything you want to challenge or anything you want to amplify for now?
Yes, thank you. I was listening with great interest, and I just wanted to pick up on a few points on which I really strongly agree. I strongly agree with Satu's point about diversity needing to really focus on small-scale producers and small-scale traders and small and medium-scale enterprises. Had I had more time, I would have said more about this. But for me, that point of diversity and the infrastructure for the local markets and marketing needs to tie really closely with the sustainable production investments that are happening. And this can help improve diversity of diets, as well as more ecologically sound production, and provide those kind of livelihoods that create the capacity to have greater access to food and more agency within food systems. So I couldn't agree more with that point. I think it's really, really crucial that we keep that focus on those small-scale producers, the small-scale traders, and food system workers in the poorest countries. And I also wanted to mention my agreement with Leonard's point and position about, of course, it's important to improve self-sufficiency within countries, but not at all costs. And obviously that's really important because we don't want these kind of short-term responses to undermine long-term transformation. And you don't want to, as I said in my presentation, expand food production without consideration for the environmental consequences. But also just to stress that this idea of food self-sufficiency, it was actually really stressed at the 1974 World Food Conference as being important, which is interesting to me because then it became kind of like for 20 years or 30 years, it was seen as like, oh, self-sufficiency is what's the word I want to use? Just like bad policy. But now it's sort of coming back. So this is really interesting to me. But I think, and I've written about this, and I'm happy to share the link in the chat, that we should think of food self-sufficiency not as an absolute either or. It's not like you're trading or you're food self-sufficient. It's that there's a continuum. And what we're seeing is that maybe some governments are trending more towards the end of importing more of their staple calories than perhaps makes sense because it makes them vulnerable, and they need to shift back towards perhaps producing more of those staple calories at home. But those staple calories don't necessarily have to be the same goods that were previously being imported. They don't have to, and because Setu is exactly right, we focus on wheat, rice and maize for the bulk of our calories, but there are lots of crops that can be grown domestically within countries that are currently food import dependent that can be grown ecologically, but they're also nutritious. So local traditional crops, we need to bring them back in terms of their acceptability in society for consumption, because they can serve all kinds of functions from dietary diversity to ecological soundness to also reducing vulnerability to global economic shocks. So yeah, sorry, lots of things to say, but I really enjoyed the conversation.
Okay, I'm loving the energy and the thoughts and the ideas. And let me boil it down to saying this. We need to make farming and agriculture great again, to coin a phrase. And I know that the president of the African Development Bank, in fact, they're meeting in Accra, I think from the 23rd to the 27th of May. He's very, very big on the agriculture and investing, not just in the big agribusiness, but in the smallholders, and to help as many countries be self-sufficient. I think it's one of his 5 fives, as he calls them. Got a couple of great questions coming in, but I need to give Jim the chance to respond to anything he's heard thus far before we go to a blockbuster question that's just come in from Judith Randell. Yes, so Jim, yes.
Great conversation. Again, I would agree with much of what is being said. I mean, I think Leonard's point about subsidies and how you get the right investments in the right area is really critical. I guess one point I wanted to raise was, how do we take this to sort of a global perspective? Because I think it's very often to see this as being an issue for low and middle income countries, but in fact, the whole issue about transforming food systems is really a global issue. I mean, if we look at the climate change impacts, if we look at the cost of health by poor diets in OECD countries, it's phenomenal. And so I think that's also something that the systems perspective and the UN Food Systems Summit has started to raise, that this isn't a north-south, rich, poor country thing. It's a global issue. And I think that then brings in a whole nother discussion around coordination and alignment when we're talking about donor countries, which I think comes back to the issues that Leonard was talking about around even coordination within the G7. So I think it's really, really critical that we see this as a global issue that affects the security and the health of everybody, and therefore work out ways to get the sort of momentum and the commitment that's needed to tackle it from that perspective.
Yeah. Setu, do you have a quick thought on that at all, about that global framework?
Gosh, yes, I have the perfect solution in my pocket. I don't.
No, but I just saw you were like that, and then you went,
Yeah, no, I was thinking, okay, I'll say
has a contribution here.
Okay, I'll say out loud what I wanted to say. I do hope that this will be a historical crisis in the sense that the global community does not invent a new fund, other new institutions, or new structures that they then tend to forget we then tend to forget in a few months when something new comes up. Yeah. We just had the Food System Summit. We all, so we already have a lot of the structures and we have enough institutions and funds and programs available. So let's just use them and move forward.
Tremendous. Leonard, you're nodding your head vigorously. Very quick thought.
Yes, let's not reinvent the wheel. There is a hub, drone-based agency hub, where the UN Food System Summit basically transitioned from Dr. Kalibata to now a follow-up. Let us identify. For us, the big challenge, Henry, is identifying the vulnerabilities country by country and region by region, because to be honest, and that is also the role of the donor community, FAO do their own work and analysis, IFAD is doing its analysis, WFP, the World Bank, and we're trying to pull all IFPRI, we're trying to pull all the intelligence out there, because this is going to be a bumpy ride and pretty rough if protracted, because we're speaking about a war that could be protracted and going into the cropping season autumn 2022 and 2023. You don't see shocks in April, May. Maybe, okay, you'd see food price inflation going up, but the big challenges comes after summer and in autumn. And that is what we need to do in terms of anticipatory action and working on the UN Food System Summit pathways and working, say, with Senegal. What do we want to do? You want to work on agroecology? Let us work on agroecology. No, not everyone wants to work on agroecology. Not everyone wants to work on climate smart. Not everyone wants to speak about healthy diets. The solutions are there. We spent one whole year of UN Food System Summit. We have pathways and coalitions. No one mentioned these coalitions. We are working through them and with the like-minded. The big challenge is the funding, because funding is going to be limited. You don't have infinite funding streams on vaccines, on vaccine sharing, on vaccine manufacturing, on climate. What we have is climate, biodiversity, food systems, and trying also to, I wouldn't say reprogram, but front load in terms of programming, but also trying to nudge the private sector, trying to nudge governments, using the SDRs and other instruments through the World Bank and the IMF and budget support, so that we target where it makes sense. We can't continue targeting on heavy input subsidies, which will not do the trick in terms of long-term transformation.
Thank you, Leonard. And in fact, Judith Randall has a comment and a question, and she's referring to something you said earlier. Completely agree with Leonard about getting finance to the lower levels. I think IFAD has estimated that something like 2% of climate adaptation finance actually reaches the smallest scale producers. What incentives, here's a question, what incentives can be applied to get financial institutions, including donors, to make different choices? At the moment, the higher transaction costs appear to be very visible, but the benefits reaching small scale producers are not. So that's from Judith. I'm looking at all your faces to see who's hungriest to devour that question. I think, Jennifer, you're looking ravenous. You want to respond to Judith's question, and why not? How would you respond to, well, her statement and then the question?
Yes, thanks. Well, as someone not in the aid world specifically, I would like to hear what the others have to say about how to get that finance to the smallest scale producers. But I would like to emphasize that it is important that aid monies do target those who are facing those structural barriers that are preventing them from engaging with food systems on their own terms. There are many people who would like to be producers, who would like to be, at the small scale, but also setting up small scale food enterprises and trading operations, et cetera. But they face those kinds of barriers because of the different power concentrations in society, the domination, market power by some of the big players, and all of these kinds of dynamics can really work against the small scale producers. And so I think that's why I wanted to emphasize in my comments the need to really target those actors in particular to enable them to engage with food systems in ways that can create livelihoods for themselves, improve resilience of food systems more generally, and ensure better food security through access because their livelihoods are better. So anyway, I would like to hear what Satu and Leonard and Jim have to say on that question as well.
Satu, you first of all. I mean, looking at that question there, what incentives can be applied to get financial institutions, including donors, to make different choices?
Well, on behalf of IFAD, what I can say is that this is indeed a problem that we've identified and that we're trying to address on our side, both in terms of our core activities where we are increasingly addressing climate as part of our work, but we've also launched a specific program called the ASA Plus, where we are collecting climate finance and then directing it to the small scale farmers and producers. And of course, it's not really an incentive. It's more like we are providing a channel for this. But of course, the climate finance area is, I think, it's something where I think if we can find ways of really providing avenues for funding to be directed towards increasingly adaptation, which is lagging behind in comparison to mitigation, and then directing it to small scale farmers, that's something that we've identified as something we can do on our side.
Tremendous. Jim, any quick thoughts on that?
I mean, firstly, just come back to what Leonard said earlier about sort of subsidies and how subsidies are going in the right direction. And correct me if I'm wrong, Leonard, but I mean, I think in orders of magnitude, global subsidies in agriculture are probably something like 50, 60, 70 times more than what the global donor communities is spending on supporting agriculture. So, you know, the fundamental question is, how do you shift those orders of magnitude if you want to think about supporting what's happening in small scale agriculture? I mean, then I think we need to come back to the fundamentals. And one of the things we highlighted in the earlier donor platform paper was just the risk of huge numbers of small fragmented projects, which are often trying to get down to support small scale holders, small scale farmers and small scale entrepreneurs, but then they actually don't add up to anything. So I think coming back to some of the fundamentals at a country level, you have to get the enabling business environment right. You know, what are the conditions you need for good business investment? You have to get the investment in infrastructure right. You have to get the investment in human skills right, and you have to get access to technology. Now, how do you get the policy working at a national level to try and drive change in those directions that can then have benefit down the track? And I think this shift towards the idea of national food systems transformation pathways perhaps start to become really important. And I think what Leonard mentioned is you can't suddenly stop subsidies, but can we start to think much more creatively about what's the transition plan that we need over a 5, 10, 15, 20-year time to reorientate all of these very fundamental structural incentives in the system to move in the direction we want. And I think if we could do a lot more work around thinking about what these sort of national transformation pathways might look like and how they could offer countries a sensible transition pathway, that would be a really good way for donors to invest. And part of that is then thinking about how can that actually lead to making sure that you do get the investment into the small entrepreneurs, the small scale agriculture and so on. I don't think we're going to solve the problem by just suddenly tipping money into a bunch of highly local focused small scale projects by donors, because donors just don't have the money to get anywhere near solving the scale of the problem if you go down that route.
Yeah, thanks for that, Jim. And I see in the chat, there's a lot of discussion about youth engaging them, reaching out to them meaningfully. And Michelle from the Secretariat is asking people to check out the thematic working group on rural youth employment page. So have a look at that. That's right. And there's further information in the chat on a variety of sounding boards. We've got a youth sounding board in the EU. Thank you for telling us about that, Leonard. Wonderful stuff. And then now we have a question from Jill. I think you're in Canada, Jill. And she's asking this of you, Jennifer. Could you provide some more information on a CFS global food crisis response framework? I recall you saying there is something already developed but needing to be expanded, though correct me if I'm wrong. How would you relate what that framework is or should be to the role or the focus of the UN Secretary General's crisis group? Your thoughts, Jill?
Thank you, Henry. Yeah, thank you, Henry, and thank you, Jill, for that question. I put that suggestion in my presentation because I think it's something that could be really useful. There's a framework for responding to protracted crises, which is a document that the CFS had agreed in 2015, and that provides guidance for when there is a protracted crisis for governments to better enable them to coordinate responses. So the idea is perhaps we need a global food crisis response framework because of the increasing frequency of crises at the global level that we've been experiencing. So it's not a product that's in place yet. It's an idea that is out there that's being discussed. And I think it's something that could be really useful. And what, obviously it doesn't exist yet, but things that it could include are, some general guidance, for example, with respect to the problem of export restrictions when crises happen. It could include general guidance with respect to reducing vulnerability to shocks on global markets, that sort of thing. So it's an idea to maybe bring together the policy guidance, and in many ways, many of these policy guidance ideas are out there already in other policy products of the CFS and other bodies, and I think they could be brought together meaningfully into a single document so that we have a place to go immediately when these crises happen, so that we don't have to keep, as someone said, we don't want to keep reinventing the wheel, and we also don't want to keep setting up these crisis response groups over and over again to discuss really fundamental issues that we already know about. We need to bring that guidance into one place so that we can go to it and say, okay, is this relevant in this case, and then move forward more quickly. And so perhaps this idea, if it comes to fruition, could be really useful for the global crisis response group right now. Thanks.
Tremendous. Thank you very much indeed for that, Jennifer. But we're going to go into a final round of questions and brief answers, if you will. So here we are. We've had a couple of years of thinking and honing this white paper down to those 7 major recommendations. We've had the Food Systems Summit in September last year, a variety of papers, lots of thinking. We've heard from Jennifer thus far, we've heard from Satu, Leonard, and Jim, of course. All of our people, delegates, participants, watching us, listening, and hoping we're going to see a breakthrough. But there's a lot of noise in the room. We've got this terrible, this war happening in Ukraine. It's affecting so many around the world in lots of different ways. We've got crises in a variety of countries. What is it, 60%, I think you said earlier, of those countries that are suffering from food insecurity, I mean, some kind of conflict. What can we look for in the short term to know that the interventions, including this white paper that we've launched formally today, are making a difference? What should we be looking out for? What should we hope to see? Leonard, to you first of all.
Look, my hope is primarily in G7. G7, so you have Germany, France, US, Canada, ourselves, Japan, working almost every week. We have lots of sessions on food security, and also interconnecting with finance, humanitarian colleagues, and feeding the UN Secretary General crisis group. This is going to be critical. The next few weeks, I would say, between now and June are critical in terms of identifying the risks, but also the solutions which will come up from the IMF and World Bank meetings. That's one. 2, I think we also need to do some more targeted coordination amongst the big players. And that is probably the role of the global donor platform. Where can we target what in terms of delivery? One of my bosses in Brussels tells me, Leonard, you can't solve 60 or 70 crises. You need to focus. But then it would require that the global donor platform identifies where amongst those 60, because we should not leave anyone behind. Where should we do what in terms of coordination? Where should we do scalable operations? Where should we be smarter? And within the EU bloc, we have Team Europe approaches, meaning that, for example, for the Sahel and Lake Chad, it's not only the EU humanitarian and international partnerships division, but it's the member states. Together, we mobilized 1 billion in terms of funding for the Sahel. The same we will do in the coming days on the Horn of Africa, identifying where and what typology of interventions, but also coordinating with the US, with Canada on what we can do. And thirdly, not losing sight of the bigger picture on climate, on adaptation, on biodiversity. We need to go in the long haul. And Jim said, this might be a bit of the big challenge that we might not have learned from the past, because some countries clearly don't want to go into that transition mode. It's a business as usual mode. We can't really force them to do it. But clearly, the limited financing streams we have, we will do it with those who really want to go to this long transition process, which is clearly inevitable if we don't want to come here in 10 years' time and speak about the same challenges.
Very good. Thank you very much indeed for that, Leonard. Satu, your thoughts, please.
Thank you, and very much agree with what Leonard has said. I think in terms of, looking at it from our side of things, again, we know we're succeeding if we are seeing a better empowered small scale producers and the smaller enterprises, more stronger local food chains that are delivering a more resilient food system at the local level. I think that's fundamentally where we are then going to be seeing, yes, there will be crisis that cannot be avoided. However, that there will be communities and countries that will be better able to manage those rapidly changing situations. So I think that's where if we're succeeding to get more work done in that space, more resources flowing to that work, and then resulting in this change, I think that's where we will be successful going forward. But of course, everything that Leonard has said about the global coordination and all that, I think is of course very much what I would also like to see. And again, really like focusing on getting the work done instead of creating new structures and new institutions, please.
Excellent. I can see Jennifer nodding vigorously there. Your closing thoughts. You set us going this afternoon, and I said it was very alarming, and when you consider just what's going on and the scale of the challenge, what are your thoughts now? What should we be looking for in the short term? I know this is long term, it's very much long term, and it's like turning around the Titanic, but what should we be looking for in the short term initially to show that this is not just another we're reinventing the wheel? We've got a real white paper with concrete things to say. What do you say?
Thank you, Henry. I did want to agree with what both Leonard and Satu have said about policy coordination, but I think I appreciate your point that we need to think about what needs to happen right away. But of course, this conversation was about keeping the longer term needs front of mind while making those short-term responses, because the last thing we want to do is make short-term responses that undermine or hinder the capacity for that longer-term transformation that's necessary. So for me, I think it's really essential that we be very thoughtful and deliberate about the short-term responses to ensure that they enable us to continue to work towards that long-term transformative agenda in food systems. I think that's really vital. And the coordination, that can't be stressed enough. I think we don't want lots of, different agencies coming out and claiming to be the one that has the best advice, et cetera. We need to all be working together to ensure that kind of coherence in terms of the policy response. And obviously the immediate short-term issues, we have to provide funding for the humanitarian agencies that are dealing with the worst starvation and hunger right now. But we also then need to be ensuring that we avoid those situations emerging from those who are finding themselves with shortfalls in the trade system. But if we're going to be finding alternative supplies for those who are left shorthanded, we need to make sure that it's done hand in hand with increasing capacity to avoid that kind of over-reliance and vulnerability. So yeah, coordination is extremely important. And I think that the idea of the hub to bring together the expert panels is really a great idea to ensure that we're not wasting resources by overlapping and contradicting one another. We need to have that coordination, and just to stress, the CFS is a really important body to be part of that as well, because it is, an intergovernmental body that is inclusive. It includes participation from civil society and from the private sector, and it has really strong legitimacy to be making these policy recommendations in concert with the other bodies that are engaged in this issue. Thanks.
So yeah, in concert, aligned. A lot of us know each other. We're not frightened of each other. I think we know what needs to be done. That's kind of what's being said. And Jim, I mean, your white paper has been given us it's a sinew of today's event. So I'm going to let you say the penultimate word, because we're going to go to Maurizio from the Secretariat in just a moment. So what next, do you think? What next, Jim?
Just picking up on what some of the others said, for me, there's three things that we really need to keep in mind at this point in time. I think the first one is that the current crisis has really underlined the issues that were raised by the CFS and Food Systems Summit last year about the need to transform food systems. But now we have to be very careful we don't race around tackling the immediate crisis and not tackling the longer term structural issues. If we do that, then we're just going to be back to square one. I think the second thing is, how do we look for the opportunities? And I was in Bangladesh a couple of weeks ago, and incomes in Dhaka are going to increase threefold over the coming 20 years or so, with a huge investment from people into what they're eating. So I think we also have to make sure that we're looking for every opportunity we can find to build on those opportunities, because if we only focus on the problems, we're not going to get there. And the final thing is just coming back to what I've mentioned a couple of times, is I think from the donor point of view, really looking at how these ideas of national food systems transformation pathways can really be a very strong, nationally led, nationally driven mechanism, but with good donor support, to really try and bring together the sort of coalitions, the policy thinking, bringing different ministries together to tackle some of the underlying issues that haven't been dealt with over many decades of time.
Tremendous. Thank you very much indeed, Jim. So Jim Woodhill, Jennifer Clapp, Satu Santala, and Leonard Mitzi, thank you very much. You've been a tremendous panel. Let's say thank you and congratulations to Rodo Peace to Musimi. But our final word will be delivered by Maurizio Navarra, who is the GDPRD's Secretariat Coordinator. Over to you, Maurizio.
Thanks a million, Henry, for being such a wonderful facilitator, and thanks to all panelists and speakers for their fantastic contributions today. As Conrad, Henry, and Jim have explained, the white paper has been the conclusion of more than a year and a half of efforts and active engagement of the platform in the food systems agenda. And with our board, we had envisaged to organize the paper launching event this spring, but it became soon clear that the current conflict was changing even more profoundly than the pandemic, the way value chains were working, food prices, global hunger and nutrition patterns, and in a way that we are still trying to grasp. Now, after all, we are a donor platform for rural development. These questions, how we can work together to help build a conducive environment towards the achievement of the SDGs, which despite all challenges are and remain our guiding line. This is the key questions we are trying to really find an orientation and light with. Now, today we've heard some very concrete proposals, and let me just conclude this event by summarizing very few key points. I'm conscious that this is not comprehensive, neither complete, but here they are. First, Professor Clapp insisted on some key policy principles, including the need to move towards new policies using a food systems lens. She also stressed the importance to strengthen resilience of food systems by enhancing sustainability, equity, and diversity. For instance, she recommended investing in climate-resilient food production methods that support decent and equitable livelihoods for small-scale producers. Secondly, our speakers also recommended donors to enable a safe and stable business environment in affected countries, helping governments in developing countries put the right policies in place, particularly those that promote investment in SMEs, facilitate market access, trade and supply chain stability, even in emergencies, is critical to ensure access to food. Also, diversity has been clearly recognized as a key enabler for improving resilience and to face the types of crises that have been now overlapping each other by reducing vulnerability. And in light of this, Satu in particular stressed how smallholder farmers and SMEs are in fact the players to be looked at because they understand diversity much better. Of course, there are investments that are required to enable and support these players. Leonard Mitzi recalled how food systems remain highly underfunded and underinvested, and the current crises are highlighting issues that we have been discussing about for a long time. Africa and the international community should support better existing processes, such as CADE, for example, that he mentioned. But in general, we don't have to invent the wheel. We know where the problems are. Now, donors can play a very important role, but they need to look at the structural barriers that hamper change in food systems. They need to look at innovation, science, data, technology, from global to local levels, supporting all these innovations and partnerships and alliances that are needed to underpin the change. And finally, all speakers insisted on the urgent need to coordinate policy responses at the international level, which includes, for instance, adopting a global food crisis response framework to guide policy responses to future crises. Now, these were just some of the takeaways, but more has been illustrated today, and more challenges will emerge in the coming months and years, because we're just starting to understand where we have to turn our attention in these confusing times. Now, the donor platform will continue to promote these types of dialogues on policies and strategies, and will also insist on promoting donor coordination at all levels for better impact. And yes, the donor platform will make sure our debates stay focused and targeted. We heard you very clearly today. So stay tuned on our work. More will come shortly, and please participate in our annual General Assembly on 15th and 16th of June on accelerating progress on the SDGs, implementing national pathways for food systems transformation. The assembly will be held in hybrid format, so those who cannot travel to Rome in IFAD can be with us virtually. Let me close the event by warmly thanking our distinguished speakers and panelists, all participants for holding with us until the end, Henry Bonzo for his usual fantastic facilitation, and last but not least, let me extend my special thanks to Jim Woodhill, who was the lead author of the white paper and has provided leadership and invaluable knowledge to the donor platform. Thank you for being with us, ladies and gentlemen, and see you next time.
Thank you very much indeed, Maurizio. Thank you very much.